Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this morning's Getting to the Point. We are at our season finale. To have with me today our guest, Doyle Albee of MAPR Agency. Good morning, Doyle. How are you today?
Great, Cindy. How about you? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing great. Thank you for being here. This is going to be a lot of fun. For those who are just starting to watch these Getting to the Point episodes, what we do here is we talk with experts in their field who are brilliant in their zone, and we talk through three key points. The point here is to get in and out in 30 minutes or so and hit on 3 points that will help the audience. And our audience is made up of entrepreneurs, small business owners, professionals in all types of areas. And today we're going to hit on public relations. So I just want to chat through how we met, Doyle, so that our audience knows. But I don't know, I think it was probably 2 or 3 years ago that you came up with Amy and presented at 1 Million Cups for Collins. Does that ring a bell? Do you remember when that was?
I think it was actually about 4 years ago. I think that was about in 16 when we first decided that we wanted to open an office in Fort Collins. And yeah, so we had a chance to meet, and you asked some really great questions, because it was one of those situations where I think 3 companies presented. And I remember we were in the back, and I was like, who's that person? She's asking the best questions. We need to know her. And that was you.
Well, I didn't remember that, but thank you. No, it was a lot of fun.
You didn't know that part till just now.
I did not know that part until just now. No, that's great. That's great. Well, it was really fun to see a PR firm kind of come in and try to, get a presence up here in Fort Collins, because you have really made a splash up here in Colorado. I know you're based in Boulder right now, and you and I remember having lunch with you down in Boulder at one of the restaurants nearby, and that was a lot of fun. Yeah, at BJ's. And I have public relations in my background as well. I was in a PR firm in DC for several years earlier in my career, and we focused on science and health companies. And I know you focus on science and tech companies. And I'll just start by saying one of the cool parts about working in PR was really having an understanding about how the news machine works, and being part of that process was cool. Being able to see how the news is made, and that I had some influence on what landed on the front page, what segment was going to go into the news that night. And I'm sure that that's part of the reason you love your job. Why don't you tell us a little about your background in PR real quick and what you do at MAPR?
Sure, I'd love to. And you're absolutely right. It's so, I mean, I think a hardcore reporter might say, oh, you PR people aren't part of the media. But I've always felt that we are, and you're absolutely right. I think if we do our jobs well, we're actually a tool that the media can use in order to help tell stories, and certainly a tool for our clients or the companies for which we work, that we can help get the right stories out into the right place. And so you hit the nail on the head. We like to say we do the hard stuff. So we focus on technology and healthcare and health tech, and we do a lot of ag tech work now. So we're excited about that. But we kind of stay out of consumer packaged goods and hospitality and restaurants. Well, we don't stay out of restaurants and bars. We go there a lot. We just don't do their work for them. So, but personally, now that I say that, it's kind of ironic. I started my career at Coors and spent about 10 years there, and learned crisis communications working for Coors, as you might imagine. In fact, I started 2 weeks after Bill Coors made an infamous speech where he was quoted as saying, "Blacks lack the intellectual capacity to succeed." So I walked in as an intern a week later, 2 weeks later, and we were kind of all hands on deck for that summer. And I let me just say, without telling the whole story, and I'm happy to share it if anybody's interested, but it was not as bad as it sounds. It was a terrible choice of words, but it was, I learned crisis PR, let's put it that way. So that was interesting. But after 10 years in consumer packaged goods with Coors, I really, my heart is in tech. So I was able to go on and ran technology for a hard disk drive company here that was actually technically headquarters in Silicon Valley, but the engineering group was here in Colorado, and then started my own firm and merged it in with another firm. And so now there's about a dozen of us between, we've got our main offices in Boulder, have the office in Fort Collins where we have one full-time and a couple of part-time people, and I pop up there. and also have an office in Denver too. So.
Awesome. Well, when you think about your zone of brilliance, Doyle, and what really gets your, you know, your motor running when you're doing your thing and you're in your business and in your client's business the way that you really shine, what is the thing that you love to do and that you feel like, man, I was really put on this earth to do this for my clients? What gets you really excited when you go to work in the morning?
Well, I'm not sure brilliance and Doyle should ever really collide in the same sentence, but
I'm
but
putting
I
it
know
there.
it gets me, but I know it gets me excited. And one of the things I think we do a really good job of, and I can actually use a real time example, is taking a story that has the potential to be really difficult, really complicated, hard to explain, hard to understand, and hard for people to get their heads around, and taking all the layers of the onion away and saying, this is what it is. And I'll give you a great example. We're helping out a company, a new client of ours that I actually met at a presentation in Fort Collins with BizWest, and they're called New Iridium. And they have developed a way to, a better way to both develop and produce pharmaceuticals. And I sat through their original presentation, and I consider myself not to be a complete idiot. And I went, I think these guys might be onto something, but I have no idea. I couldn't have told you what they do. And so they won a prize from us. So we started out pro bono with them, and we agreed to do some messaging. And I was horrified because I really didn't think I was bright enough to get my head around what they did. And we sat in a conference room in my office for a couple hours. And now I can tell you that a lot of drugs are made with iridium, which requires heat. It's a catalyst, and it causes the reaction to take place, and then out the back end comes drugs. Well, it's expensive, it's lengthy, and it's dangerous. It's, you know, it's a radioactive material. So what these guys have developed is a way to do it with light instead of heat, fewer steps, and you don't need a radioactive material.
Okay.
So
There, see,
I'm very,
you just nailed it.
yeah, just
You
took
can
it
do
apart.
it.
So we just, and I was very excited for them. We just issued a release that we're working on. They are being tested right now on remdesivir, which is one of the most promising, we think, treatments for COVID-19. So, you know, here we are in, you know, Colorado and Northern Colorado in
Exciting.
particular, you know, really reaching out and doing some exciting work that could change the global economy. And that's what gets me out of bed in the
Yeah.
morning. And that's quite honestly why I like the
Okay.
tech side of things. You know,
Yeah.
a new beer is great, and I like it as much as the next guy, but to be able to say my clients are helping out with remdesivir. Another client of mine has a part on the Mars rover that just launched. So we
So
are
cool.
just really excited, or just launching, I've lost track. But I love working on those big kind of fun, geeky stories. That's really
Yep.
where our company really sets forth.
We're going to jump into the myth just 1 second, but I think that you and I have something in common with regard to that desire and kind of hunger to help people understand really complex things with more ease, because there's a gem inside of those complex sentences and ideas in my right, where I'll be watching startup founders pitch and it's like, what are you talking about? I know you have an amazing idea and you're brilliant, but let's bring it down to a new level. So I think that's awesome. So Doyle, let's pop into our first myth. And you and I talked offline about how you wanted to bring forward 3 myths today about what most people think about when they think of PR, and you wanted to kind of right the wrongs. So I'm going to throw at you the first myth that you wrote out for me, and you tell us more about it and how we can kind of debunk that. So myth number 1 is that stories land with media because these PR pros out there like yourselves, they just have an in with reporters and they just ask for favors, right? So that is one of the myths that you kind of presented. So why don't you talk to us a little more about that and then show us behind the curtain what really is happening when it comes to PR and getting those stories to land.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's kind of 2 parts to that myth. One is, well, 2 parts to the statement. The first part is that I know a lot of reporters, and my staff knows a lot of reporters, and that's absolutely true. And we work with a lot of the same reporters over and over. The myth part is, so because they're, you know, our professional friends, they'll write a lousy story for us. Not so much. And so, you know, everything from BizWest to the Denver Post to the Wall Street Journal, I can pick up the phone and I can get a journalist to take my call. There are people that I've worked with for 1, 2, 5, 10 years. And in fact, sometimes they call us looking for stories. But that doesn't mean that I can call up with something that doesn't make any sense, or that
Right.
isn't particularly newsworthy and get that reporter to cover it. Basically, if you think about it, what I'm asking to do, imagine if somebody called you and said, hey, I know this is really kind of unethical for your position, but hey, we're old friends, Cindy, could you do this unethical thing for me and just put this in because my client's really breathing down my neck? And when you ask a reporter to cover a story that doesn't deserve coverage, doesn't make sense, isn't appropriate for his or her beat, whatever the case might be, that's not how it works. So I've also got to be very careful. Part of the reason I can pick up the phone and call a reporter or a number of reporters is because I don't abuse that privilege. So when I
Mhm.
pick up the phone, and a lot of times what we do is we'll pick up the phone and call and say, I'll call my friend at the Wall Street Journal who writes the CFO Journal. She edits the CFO Journal. And I might call Kimberly and say, Kimberly, I know this isn't you, but I have this story that I think is perfect for the Wall Street Journal. Would you consider giving me a warm handoff or at least pointing me in the right direction of the reporter or editor that might be interested in this? She is appreciative of that. And in fact,
Yep.
Kimberly sends me all the really bad pitches she gets and when she
Okay.
takes the time to respond and laugh at them. So it's really important to understand that you're not hiring, if you are doing PR on your own, or if you're hiring somebody, whether it's a sole practitioner or the world's largest PR firm, you're not hiring a Rolodex. You're hiring an understanding of how to, as we talked about, how we started this, how to tell a story, whether it's complicated or not, how to get it to a reporter, editor, influencer, blogger, et cetera, that might be interested in it, and how to work that through the process.
Yeah, and
If I was only as good as my Rolodex, I'm pretty short-lived.
right, right. Well, and what happens when you pitch a story that isn't newsworthy is you yourself and your agency now, you lose credibility. And what you need instead is to build that integrity for, when the phone rings and it's Doyle, I'm pretty sure he's got a good story, or else he needs my help to find someone who can publish that story. And so authenticity in that pitch process is so important, and that, that honest, transparent nature is really important. So awesome.
I remember when I was working for a hardware company in the late 90s, and a lot, the internet was really starting to get traction. A lot of people were starting to put up review sites, and they would call me and say, hey, if you'll send me 4 or 5 hard drives, I'll promise you a great review. Now, it was my job to get great reviews, so I was happy. It was cheap for me. Here's 5 hard drives. But in the back of my mind, I would think that's not going to last, because why would you want to go to a hardware review site that gives a great review to something, not because it's a great product, but because they got a free one for their friend? And
Right.
sure enough, those sites didn't make it. And in fact, a true journalist, when I worked with the folks at CMP Publications or Ziff Davis Publications, not only wouldn't they do that, they wouldn't even keep the hard drive. I would send them a hard
Okay.
drive to evaluate, and they would send it back because they couldn't keep it, because they didn't want to have any appearance of impropriety.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I think you make an excellent point that it's got to be for the right reasons and in the right process and in the right flow to get things done the way that it ought to be. So that's great. Okay, are we ready for number 2? Should we just head into myth number 2?
Do we have a commercial break first for Mythbusters, and then we'll come back afterwards?
Mythbusters. I wish I had like a little, I wish Cindy Kalman could have put me together with a little icon, right, Cindy? We'll have to plan for season. No. Okay, so myth number 2 is that, I kind of reworded this one a little bit, but I think what you were trying to get at is people think, you know what, if I play in the small markets and get my story in small papers or on smaller audience blogs and such, then I'm not really going to be able to play in the big ones. And I think that that's a very common myth. Like you're gonna spend your time and your money, and then that's where it's going to end. So can you tell us why you thought of that myth, and then explain it a little more, flip it around for us?
Sure, I get that quite often, especially in the startup and scale-up world. We'll say, well, let's get you started with BizWest. Let's get you started with the Colorado Sun. Let's get you started maybe with even a TechCrunch, somebody that's covering a very niche area. And they're like, no, I want to save this story for the Wall Street Journal. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about a couple of things here. Let's
Not
talk
there
about if
yet.
your story's right for the Wall Street Journal. And 2, if you're going to make a mistake in an interview, let's make it in BizWest, not the Wall Street Journal. And that's not to pick. I love BizWest. We work with them every day. Great outlet.
Yeah.
But it's still a smaller footprint. But the biggest myth there is that the Wall Street Journal thinks BizWest is competition. And I don't mean to say that Wall Street Journal doesn't think much of BizWest. They just understand that we have 2 different audiences.
Hmm.
And in
Right.
fact, quite the opposite is true. Sometimes we'll be pitching a story and it's legitimate, and we are calling New York Times, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, doing some of the larger outlets. And one of the questions I'll get from reporters is, I notice they haven't even been covered in their local outlets yet.
Mhm.
What are you calling me for? And
Right. You have
so
to lay the breadcrumbs, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're kind of looking for their fellow journalists to go, okay, this makes sense. As these guys were coming up, they're going, it's not that they want them to pay their dues, but they realize that another journalist has looked into this. And so they've done a little bit of that. Okay, this is legit. You know, it didn't come out that the guy was, you know, had 12 federal charges against him when this story broke. So some of those little check marks that they've got to go through have been checked. And now it makes sense for you to, with the angle that you're bringing me for this story, makes sense. But if I hear the phrase stealth mode one more time, I'm going to completely lose my mind. It is absolutely okay to say I'm not going to do proactive public relations right now, but this stealth mode thing, and people will
Yeah.
say, well, I can't talk to the camera. They called me, but I'm in stealth mode. Calm
Oh,
down.
right.
One of my other things, and kind of a side note, is I will tell you that it is I don't know if it's a policy, but it's darn close. If you raise money and you do something that hits the Edgar database, so you've got to file with the SEC in excess of $250,000, you will get a call from BizWest. They want to cover
Right.
that, they will do it. So I always tell my clients, if you're going to raise money and you know you have to go on the Edgar database, let's be prepared for that call. And I'm in stealth mode is not the right
Yeah,
answer. It's
exactly.
let's be prepared for when you get that call. Let's have, you don't have to tell your whole story. You don't, you know, you're not under any obligation to do anything as a private company, but you also can't say don't write
Sure.
about me yet. They're going to
Right.
write about you. So maybe it makes sense to add a little bit more to the story than what's in your Edgar file. So
So
again, just be prepared.
Doyle, I got a question for you on that line. If, let's say you are a small startup, you are looking at a tech, you know, some tech outlets that you want to have cover you. Is there any hard and fast rule about how long it would take to get into some of those bigger markets? What is the process and timing? I know it depends on a lot of factors, but how long would it take a company to get into some of the bigger outlets in the region or even national news from those breadcrumbs they're establishing early on?
Yeah, you know, and you're right. That's kind of a how long is a piece of string question. But
Right.
what I think too many people want to do is have, you know, the average news release is 400 to 500 words. And
Mhm.
when you think about the heavy lift that you're asking those 400 to 500 words to do, I want to introduce you to a company you've never heard of in a space you maybe didn't know that existed, with a product you didn't know needed to be. You don't understand, you know, you're that's a lot of information to get into 400 or 500 words. So break it down into a chapter book, right? So I want
Yep.
to introduce my company. I want to do this. So I think it takes my kind of rule of thumb in less of a timeline, but I think it takes, with a handful of exceptions, maybe 2 to 5 touches to a
Okay.
media outlet and a reporter, when once you get to the right person, to have them go, oh, okay, I see what you're doing here. They're around. I will tell you, especially in the startup world too, a lot of reporters have been burned with startups that, hey, I told you this wonderful thing, and you know this is going to happen, and 6 months later they ran out of runway, they shut things down. So reporters are looking for a little bit of longevity, a little bit of
Yeah.
proof point that I've got. And that's not to say they won't cover things, but um, I turn down now. I get calls all the time with like, hey, can you help me with my Kickstarter campaign? And most
Yeah.
reporters will
Yeah.
say, I won't even consider it until you've reached your
Mhm.
funding goal, because,
Yeah.
and even after you reach your funding goal, a lot of those products never see the light of day. So the reporters are not taking flyers on maybes.
You know, it makes a lot of sense. And I really love the analogy you gave about book chapters. So it's like, well, because, you know, reporters don't want really a one and done kind of a thing. If they're going to start a relationship with you, they want to know what's coming in those, you know, book chapters. So if you're planning for a PR launch, you might want to have in the can, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 story ideas you're going to roll out. I remember, it reminds me of when I was at the PR agency in DC, I was on a client that was a CRO, a contract research that did, you know, all kinds of clinical trials, and they were totally unknown to the larger region and nation at that time. So we had to build those stories and roll them out one at a time, do that relationship building. We could really help them understand what they do in simple terms and how they were helping the greater region and really on a global scale what they were doing. So it does
Right.
take time and planning and effort. So that's the point.
Well, and even, you know, the story I told about New Iridium, you know, my new sense was like, I'm going to call up and say remdesivir and the world's going to beat a path to my door, right? And I actually had a good conversation with a reporter friend of mine. They said, no, this is a really cool story. Please keep me posted. But I'm not going to cover the fact that you got a grant to experiment. I want to hear about it when it's like, okay, the experiment worked. And now
Right.
remdesivir, you know, so they said, you know what, we are really resisting, you know, writing about the next hydroxychloroquine, or that may or may not work, or the next remdesivir that may or may not work. We really want to get to that point. You know, we think that's a public service. So it's, you know, sometimes it's not even skepticism or lack of belief. It's, hey, I like what you've got here, but it's, you know, why don't you put it in the oven for another 20 minutes and then call me and see how the cake looks.
You need some results, you know, something to stand on. It sounds like that is always a better way to go, until you're really well known, and then you do have things you can leak. If you're like Apple and you have a new version of something coming out, that's a totally different story. But yeah, that's a great point. Okay.
Yeah, well, Apple can wake up this morning and go, hey, we're still Apple, and they get coverage. So
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Well, as many on the call here joining us today might expect, we are going to dig into the term off the record. And I would hear on that, you know, can you really talk off the record? And it sounds to me like people think they can, which is the myth, but that they really can't. So why don't you tell us a little more about that, how that dance works between the reporter and those who are being interviewed? And is there such a thing as off the record?
And with a couple of exceptions that we'll talk about in a second, the answer is no. If you're speaking to a reporter, you are on the record. And I say that not because reporters are horrible, devious people, although some of them are certainly looking for a scoop. But think about a reporter's day. A reporter is going to talk to 6, 7 people a day, and they're taking notes and they're writing things down and they're flipping around. And then they're going to go back 2 to 5 to 10 days later and go back to those notes and write a story. There is a better than average chance that a reporter, you will say to the reporter, well, I need to tell you this. This is off the record. I'm not supposed to tell you this yet. They write it down. And somehow in those notes, it just that little portion, they took, you know, 8 pages of notes about you. And there's that little portion that's off the record. 10 days later, they forgot that, and they can blow that off the record and not mean to be a bad person or anything else. Just a simple mistake, right? And most reporters will say, if it's off the record, don't tell me. I'm not going to be responsible for that. And some reporters will, depending, you know, if you're in politics, for example, off the record's like, you know, hey, that's great. He just told me that off the record. And you bet I'm running with it, you know?
Right. What a joke.
So, yeah, it's like, of course. There is the time that I use, and I won't call it off the record, I use the phrase background, but a lot of times I'll call and pitch a reporter, and, you know, let's say, Cindy, you're the CEO of New Iridium, and I really want them to talk to you. And so they start to ask me questions. I will say, okay, I'm happy to answer your questions, but please understand that I'm a background source, meaning I'm more than happy to tell you more about this to see if you're interested in it, but please don't quote me. And I'm not going to say anything that's bad if they did. It's just, it doesn't make sense to have the PR person quoted. I want the CEO to be quoted. I mean, Chern's a PhD in chemistry. I am light years from that, right? So it's appropriate to say that. So at that juncture, if they were to happen to quote me, it wouldn't be the end of the world, but it's just not the best way to do things. But other than that, I've stopped interviews in the middle of interviews with clients who have said, well, let me answer that, but I want to go off the record for a minute. And I will stop and say, if you want to answer that, fine, but I'm not going to hold this reporter off the record. And if you need to say something off the record, do we need to say this? And clients have gotten fairly irritated with that, but it just, I've seen people get burned. I've seen careers go down. And if you're a publicly traded company and you say something off the record that happens to be, let's say you do something that has a little bit of a, hey, I can't tell you this, but we're going to make a huge product announcement in 2 weeks, that can swing stock one way or the other. And that's illegal. I mean, that is actually a criminal offense. And I feel that it's my responsibility, you know, just like your attorney can't let you lie on the stand, I can't let you go in and make that level of mistake with a reporter, whether you're public or not.
Right. No, I think that's a huge piece to the puzzle, is just you need to protect yourself as a reporter so that you're not put in a situation that requires you to make unethical or, you know, decisions, or invites you to do that. And that's just it's an important thing to know. So for all those watching now or on the recorded version later, be careful. Don't say that you don't want to speak on, that you want to speak off the record, because the record's always on, I guess would be the point.
Wait, if you have something exciting that you want to tease, I think it's absolutely appropriate to say, you know, we do have something that we think we're going to be able to announce in about 2 weeks. I can't say anything today. May I call you back in a couple of weeks, or can I have Doyle call you back in a couple of weeks? That's absolutely fine.
Yeah, and then you're
but
generating excitement about and timing about when to reach back out, and there is something cooking, but you don't know what it is. So yeah.
And every good reporter is going to say, well, give me a hint. It's like, no, I can't give you a hint. Just, may I call you? And if you think it's nothing, that's fine. We'll have a 2-minute conversation and move on.
Yep, exactly. Awesome. Well, Doyle, if you can believe it, we're already almost to the end of today's episode, but we did make it through all 3 of the myths, which has been great. I hope our audience has gleaned some insights from the benefit of your experience about those 3 myths. I'm going to close with the 2 rapid fire questions that I close with all of my episodes. Great. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. The first one has to do with a person in your life who has been influential as a mentor or a leader that has helped you, who has helped you get to where you are. Who has been influential that when you look back, you go, you know what, I would not be where I am today without that person's guidance and advice.
That's an easy one. My great mentor, Joe Fuentes. Joe and I worked together at Coors for a number of years, but he really, a lot of the things I said today were, here's how you deal with reporters, here's how you do this. Joe was an editor at the Rocky Mountain News for 20 years before he went into public relations. So it was Joe that taught me, when you write a news release, if you write fluff, don't bother. If you do this, he drilled the AP style book into my brain he was my first boss out of college. And just, you know, he'd say, you're going to call a reporter and ask them that? Really? Are you going to do that? Because they're not going to appreciate, they're going to take your call because you're from Coors, but they're not going to appreciate, you know, that Coors is having people call with things like that. So he was what really taught me is like, okay, before I pick up the phone and talk to a journalist, where's my head? Does it make sense? Am I helping that journalist move their job forward as well? Right. Joe died 10 years ago. It's hard to believe, of cancer. Wow. It took him too soon, but his picture, to show you what a great journalist and PR guy he was, he's got one of the caricatures at the Denver Press Club. So.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we all have, that's a great story. Thanks for sharing that about Joe. But we all have, I think the reason I asked that is because I like to hear from people who has helped them in their journey, but also to reflect on how each of us are guiding probably someone in our lives and we may not know it. And so it's always so important to maintain that high character and integrity when we're working with other people, because we sometimes know who we're leading and guiding, and sometimes we don't, and we just always want to maintain that level of you know, go and give kind of an attitude. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, my last rapid fire is, what book are you reading right now, and what tip can you share with us or insight from the book that would help all of us today?
Well, I always have 2 or 3 going because I've got ADD, I think. At the end of the day, I just want to look up the authors. But the one I'll share with right now, by the way, I am reading, because I watched the Netflix documentary on the Becoming book tour with Michelle Obama, and I hadn't read Becoming yet, so I picked that up. So that's one of them on my nightstand. But I'm also reading, and in fact, I do book clubs with my senior team. And so we're reading a book called The Art of Client Service by Robert Solomon and Ian Schaefer. And it's written by 2 agency guys, and it's talking about how do you do a really great job at client service? Because at the end of the day, if I don't have clients, I like to tell my whole staff that we're all fired on the 31st, and hopefully everybody calls back on the 1st, and we get to keep going, right? Yep. So we are, and I'm a great believer that I can't think of a book that I've read that I went, wow, I'm going to completely upend my entire life, my entire business, and just do it this way. But do you get 2 or 3 or 4 things that are kind of cool? And we've already found one thing that we are working on that we took a step back and said, you know, that's a really good point, and we don't do a great job at that. And so let's It is, we do a great job. Our proposals are, I think they're really, really good. And then when we get to the point, it's like, hey, come on in, we want to meet your staff. We all kind of show up and go, hey, we're here. You know, what's going, let's talk about the proposal. And this book talks about, you really need to have a pregame, you know, who talks when, who does what slide, just for her style. I mean, this book goes, I think, further than we like to. It's like, see if you can go see the client's conference room and get the, you know, understand who's going to sit in what chair. And it's like, that's a little bit far, but
Yeah.
we just stepped back and said, you know what, we don't do a really good job preparing for those meetings and thinking about this and anticipating what might be asked. And so let's up our game. And so we kind of had a conversation about 3 weeks ago. Since then, we've made 2 presentations and we got 2 new clients. So we might have gotten them anyway, but I will say this on a personal level, and I think on all my staff level, we all had a lower level of anxiety walking into those, because those meetings are stressful. You're going into basically, it's like a job interview, right?
Yep.
And we felt better walking in because we were prepared. And it was one of those, so it's like, you know, great.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much. I mean, I've been doing a lot of coaching lately during this strange pandemic time about, running better meetings and having that agenda and being, you know, it's the same thing about when you're in control of your message or your pitch deck and you know exactly what's coming and your message is right here. It's, you know, your meeting is a message too. And so having that ability to be in control of that, provide that agenda and really run it and be the force in the room. There's so much confidence that can come from your team and also be shown to your clients that you know what you're doing, you're ready to roll and you're really good at this. And this is our plan for the day. So I think that's a great takeaway to implement. Well, awesome, Doyle, we're out of time, but tell us how people can reach you really quickly through whatever website or social handles you have, and then we'll wrap and we'll go to our after show.
You bet. The easiest thing to remember is our website is mapr.agency. So no .com, no anything, just mapr.agency. And all my social media is there, my email's there. It's just doyle@mapr.agency. But if you have a question, a follow-up, if you want to challenge me on something, I'm good at getting back on email, so feel free to reach out. And all of our phone numbers are there. And I haven't been in Fort Collins much because of these uncertain times, but I'm usually up there at least a day a week and hope to get that rhythm back again.
Yeah, we all do, don't we? Really, I'm excited to get back to in-person stuff and clapping audiences and nervous people on stages. It's going to be great someday. Right?
Well, snacks. I mean, we all lost snacks, right? Yeah, it's like
awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to clip us off here and then restart a recording for our after show. But this has been Getting to the Point, episode 12 of season 1. We will start airing season 2 coming up this fall. And if anyone is interested in talking to me about becoming a guest and applying for that, would love to hear from you. And thanks for showing up and have a great day. Get out there, go nail it.